That's good. Today we're sitting here with Tad Daley, and he just gave a speech to a group with the Physicians for Social Responsibility about his new book, Apocalypse Never. And can you tell us just a little bit why you got involved with this book?
Well, you know, there are many causes, Brett, that engage our interests and our passions, and I care about many other causes and issues. But the thing about the nuclear issue that really, I think, captured my heart and captured my attention was this simple proposition that on July 16th, 1945, suddenly, for the first time in human history, the human race had the power to bring about its own extinction by its own hands. And here we are now, 65 years later, and we still say that we have to take that risk, that we have to base our national security on a doctrine that contains the possibility, however remote it might be at any particular political hour, but still the possibility existing that we could engage in some kind of a horrific orgy of miscalculation that could literally lead to bringing about our own extinction by our own hands.
Yeah.
I just think that's beyond all toleration. It's something that we need to engage our imaginations about to do something better.
In the book, you talk about different scenarios for a problem or an accident or an intentional act. Can you talk about those briefly and kind of categorize those in terms of which one you think has the most possibility of occurring?
Well, yeah, thank you, Brett. The paradigm that I choose in the book is to say that there's probably a few others, but I think there are four major scenarios that we could envision by which an actual detonation of nuclear weapons in major cities can actually come about. One is nuclear terror. That is an attack on a city, not by a state, but by some kind of a non-state actor. Muhammad Atta's cousin. God knows Muhammad Atta and his cronies, if they'd gotten their hands on an atom bomb on 9/11, they would have used it. And God knows there are people trying to do that today. And since you asked about likelihood, I think that, before I give you the other three scenarios, I think that is probably the most likely one to happen in the near term. It could happen tomorrow morning. There are thousands of nuclear weapons around the planet. There are thousands of tons of weapons-usable nuclear material by which terrorists could construct a crude nuclear device, and even if 999 out of 1,000 fail at the task, that's not good enough. The second scenario I can concoct or describe, perhaps is a better word, is what I call simply accidental atomic apocalypse. The possibility that not just one, but 101 nuclear missiles, each with a warhead much more powerful than anything a terrorist could construct, could be launched by accident. And the chapter really details that kind of thing has come very close to happening several times in the 2/3 of a century of the nuclear age. The third scenario is what I call nuclear crisis mismanagement. And in that chapter I quote Robert McNamara, who said, "There will be no learning curve." And it's the scenario where one or more nuclear-armed actors get engaged in some kind of a beef, and there's a crisis atmosphere, and there's miscalculation and misinterpretation and misinformation, and suddenly one side decides that things are going to go south quickly, and so they need to launch a nuclear strike first. That happened at least two times during the Cold War, one in October of '62, the Cuban Missile Crisis, one in the fall of 1983, a crisis very few people know about called the Able-Archer Crisis, where Soviet leaders mistakenly concluded that NATO war games taking place in Western Europe were actually preparations for the West launching a nuclear war on the Soviet Union. We weren't, but they thought we were. And my fear is that someday somebody's going to conclude that somebody's preparing a nuclear strike, so they're going to launch a nuclear strike first. Finally, the fourth and final scenario is what I call simply conscious, intentional use. This is not a crisis. This is not a moment of panic. This is not a lot of misinformation and miscalculation. This is some national leader in a cold, sober, rational manner deciding that that country's national interests in this particular time, in this particular place, will be served by launching a nuclear first strike and starting a nuclear war. And I simply don't have confidence that we can keep these things around for decades and decades to come without one of those eventualities eventually
and perhaps even soon coming to pass.
Can I interject a question here, just to backtrack a little bit? On the 1983 incident that you're talking about, where we had the almost nuclear war.
Yes.
In your opinion, do you think that the Reagan aides talking about winning a nuclear war around the same time had anything to do with the Russians?
It totally did. Yes, indeed. Yeah, that's one of the reasons. Well, I mean, let me be clear. As far as I know, we weren't planning to start a war with the Soviet Union, nuclear or conventional. The NATO war games really were NATO war games. But precisely because of what you described, the fact that the Reagan administration was A, building up our nuclear arsenal, B, engaging in nuclear saber rattling, C, we had the mistaken shoot down of the KAL-007 airliner just a few months before that. And D, yes, the fact that Reagan's aides were publicly and without apology talking about waging and winning a nuclear war. That clearly was one of the variables that, along with all kinds of intelligence information, some of which was probably accurate and most of which was inaccurate, I mean, the Soviet intelligence operations. But yes, when we talked about that, that clearly gave an impression to the leaders of the Soviet Union that we might actually be willing to do that.
Okay, now about your book, just came out about 3 weeks ago. You've been on tour. Can we talk about the tour and how's it going and what's next and things like that?
Well, sure, yeah. It's I'm not sure I'd use the word tour. Book tours are somewhat a relic of the past, even the Random Houses of the world. It is Rutgers University Press, and I'm very pleased with them. They, since you asked, got myself an agent 2 or 3 years ago, and we got offered 3 book contracts, and we went with Rutgers because they said to us, with us you get the best of both worlds. You get both the gravitas of an academic press, but we intend to market your book as a trade book, Tad, because you, Tad, have stated this aspiration, and it's not for me to say whether I've succeeded, but I certainly hope so, which is to write a book about the nuclear peril and the vision of abolition that's not for wonks, that's not for experts, that's not for scholars, but really for ordinary women and men who simply care about the fate of the world. So Rutgers is very much behind it. On the other hand, they have two marketing people who are marketing 99 books, so I'm doing my best to do guerrilla book marketing. But I'm basically hoping to spend much of the rest of this year, 2010, traveling around the country and speaking to as many audiences as I can, and getting on as many radio stations as I can, and talking on the internet as much as I can about the book, about the nuclear peril, and most importantly about the proposition that the only long-term solution to the threat of nuclear annihilation is the abolition of nuclear weapons. And my hope is that my book articulates plausible political futures, Brett, by which that might actually come about.
Well, coincidentally, there's a movie coming out in about 3 or 4 weeks called
right.
Countdown to Zero,
Yeah.
which is has a similar message to your book about the threat and the need for abolition. And you've been invited to speak at one of the events, the debut in Washington, D.C. Can you talk about that movie a little bit and how this kind of works together with your book?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I wasn't involved with making the movie, and I know the people just kind of peripherally, but I'm delighted that the movie is coming out, Countdown to Zero. It's a coincidence that my book and the movie are coming out at virtually exactly the same time. And I have said that I think it's fair to say that book, that movie, Countdown to Zero, and my book, Apocalypse Never, really have exactly the same ambition. And that ambition is twofold. One, to talk to ordinary folks about the nuclear peril rather than scholars and experts and wonks. And B, to really say that abolition must be the solution. So, and given the fact that a movie and a book are very different mediums, some of the Countdown to Zero people have said, gee, we need to have things that we can recommend to people to read when they say, what can I read to read more about this? So I hope that my book and that movie, and hopefully the work of, these are hardly the only elements, the work of many NGOs, the work of many peace activists on the ground can really build. Can do 2 things, Brett. One is to make the nuclear issue much more prominent than it is now. A lot of people think of it as a relic of the Cold War, and I really want to get it back on the mainstream radar screen and to get sort of ordinary women and men and the peace community really focused on the nuclear peril. A, because it is so immediate, and B, because I think the calculus has clearly changed about abolition, and suddenly the idea of nuclear weapons abolition is something that mainstream people are really talking about. And if we can really build